So welcome everyone to a new class. This year we're going to be studying the Book of Ezekiel, Sefer Yechezkel, and we're going to be. I think what I'm going to do this time is there are a lot of chapters that we're just going to go through chapter by chapter, but in certain places we'll maybe skip or summarize because it's a very long book. But it is an important book, and there's numerous reasons why. Before I start talking about the Book of Ezekiel, Sefer Yechezkel, I do want to remind people what my approach is, which is generally, and I think with this group it's a less of a surprising thing, but I generally look at books of prophecy in their historical context. I look at them as how would the initial people hearing this prophecy or reading this prophecy, how would the initial audience understand it? What was it meant to do with that initial audience? Also, sometimes we'll talk about, the impact it has later on. With Yechezkel, that is quite a bit. In other words, there's a tremendous amount of theological, I could say, novelty, because the word is the uniqueness in Yechezkel that becomes part and parcel about what we think about Judaism and Jewish beliefs. And it becomes integral to Jewish belief. And we see it first with Yechezkel. So there's some of that we're going to be talking about. Also, I am going to look at the book as, for the most part, composed by or said or in some way by Yechezkel, by Ezekiel, and to the generation of Babylonian exiles, the initial Babylonian exiles from Jerusalem. In other words, I am not taking the approach that this was a later work that pretends to be Yechezkel. I mostly will look at it as a unified work, except where there are certain places that are really indicated as different editorial kind of additions. And that is my approach to the book. This approach to this book is fairly well grounded in modern approaches as well. In other words, this is not something that's foreign to modern approaches, not just Kaufman, right? Kaufman will always do that, but really accepted modern approaches will look at this book as connected to Yechezkel, as connected to that generation. But of course, there are absolutely modern scholars who will put it later. I always find that when we're talking about a book like Ezekiel, like Yechezkel, which is already relatively late in the books of prophecy, to put it much later, where you're putting it essentially in Second Temple literature, I feel like no one addresses the elephant in the room, which is, then why does it not read like Second Temple literature? These days, we have Second Temple literature. We know the language that it uses. We know the style it has. That is absolutely not where Yechezkel is at, right? That's interesting to me, that and we see this a lot with the whole school of thought, what's commonly called the Copenhagen school, which puts all of the biblical books relatively late without accounting for how different they are from the actual late books that we know were late and we know when they were written, so, or more or less know when they were written. So that is an objection I generally have when scholars put books very late. But you do have a certain amount of wiggle room with Yechezkel, because you could say, well, it's from the Return to Zion. The beginning of the Return to Zion, you still have some pretty biblical style books, but the language that Yechezkel, Ezekiel uses for things like sacrifices, etc., is much closer to the language of Vayikra, of Leviticus, than it is to the language of Chronicles, of Divrei Yamin, as has been shown. So still, I would say that, so I think, and again, books have been written on this. There's a very well researched approach that looks at this book as essentially Yechezkel's book, spoken to the initial exiles. Now, who are these initial exiles? When are these initial exiles? For those on my email list, I sent you the kind of a short chronology. I'm going to put it up on the screen now. So here, I'm just showing kind of the relevant timeline. So the rise of the Babylonian Empire, of course, everything is BCE, before the Common Era here, late 610s, 610 to 586. is Jeremiah's Yirmiyahu. He has a relatively long period of prophecy, according to his book, certainly. Nebuchadnezzar II rises 604 to 562, and then the conquest of Jerusalem during that reign, right, by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar II, right? Initially, 3,000 Judeans are taken to Babylonia. This is what we call the exile of Jehoiachin, okay? That is the first exile of Jerusalemites to Babylonia. That's when Yechezkel is exiled with the rest of the cream of Jerusalem, the best of the craftspeople, the nobility. They are all exiled, right? And then from that point on, Yechezkel is a prophet in Babylonia. Now there is then let me take a step back for a second and explain how this works, why you have a two-stage conquest here. This was something that was already set up by the Assyrians, that essentially you have a 3 strikes and you're out policy. Okay, essentially the first time you fight, you become a vassal state. That means you are independent, you have your own king, but you must give a lot of taxes to the empire. If you say, no, I'm not going to pay my taxes, what happens? Well, there is a fight. They conquer you. And the next stage is, well, you're not just a vassal state. Your king is a puppet king that is set up by the empire. Now, in this case, that puppet king is Tzidkiyahu, right? Zedekiah, he gets a new name when he becomes king. He is from the royal family, but he is selected by the Babylonian Empire. You are king, but you must be loyal to us. That is when that first exile happened. So, looking back at our timeline, when Jerusalem is first conquered, there's an initial kind of rebellion, and then Jerusalem is conquered, right? And that rebellion is simply, we're not going to give you taxes, right? So they're conquered by the Babylonians, right? There's the 3,000 Judeans are taken to Babylonia, according to 2 Kings and the book of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu. And those kind of the nobility and kind of higher class people of Jerusalem all go into exile. Now, at that time, Tzidkiyahu, Zedekiah, is set up as king in Jerusalem, and that's the idea. The idea is that now he's going to be a puppet king, and they're going to be loyal to the Babylonian Empire. And of course, it doesn't work out that way, right? Everyone in Jerusalem and everyone in Judea thinks that it is the divine will to, in fact, rebel against Babylonia. Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu constantly tells them, no, it is not. Please do not rebel. By the way, Yechezkel also is taking the tack of, guys, settle into Babylonia because you're not going home anytime soon. And then when Tzidkiyahu himself rebels, in other words, the puppet king, quote unquote, who hasn't really been a puppet king almost from the beginning, he rebels and says no. There is the total conquest of Jerusalem, and this is the 3rd strike, right? That again was kind of already set up by the Assyrian Empire. Same thing happened to the Ashdodis, like all sorts of different groups. This is what happened to that. They were at different stages of rebellion. Some stayed in stage 2, some were actually completely exiled. So the Jerusalemites are completely exiled. The Jerusalem is destroyed. And then you have more Judeans taken to Babylonia, okay? And we know essentially from an account that we have very briefly in Yirmiyahu 52:30, the book of Jeremiah 52:30, that in 582 there were another 750 that were exiled. Okay, so that was after that. That was after the destruction. So there you had 586. You had an exile, and then 4 years later there was another exile of 750 Judeans. Okay. Now we know from later accounts that there were some Judeans that or from in the area that stayed in the countryside. We know that from some of the censuses that are quoted in the book of Ezra, Nehemiah, Ezra, Nehemiah. We have censuses that are presented not necessarily as talking about people who have remained, but it seems to be reflecting people who have remained in the countryside. But Jerusalem is destroyed, and for all intents and purposes, the Judeans are exiled, right? And they settle in Babylonia, okay, or most of them do. So but Yechezkel is talking right here. This is where Yechezkel is. Yechezkel, for a large part of his book, the temple hasn't been destroyed yet. He is predicting the destruction of the temple. Okay, he's predicting the destruction of the temple at the same time that Yirmiyahu is in Jerusalem, right? But Yechezkel is very, very different. How is Yechezkel different from Yirmiyahu, from Jeremiah? Yechezkel is different. First of all, he is very well respected in his community, right? Which Yirmiyahu absolutely is not, right? We all know the travails that Yirmiyahu goes through. Yechezkel is respected. People come to listen to him and get his advice and get his input and hear his prophecies. It is, yes, he may be also entertaining, as in the popular Israeli song that is actually based on a specific passage where it talks about how everyone's coming to listen to him. But he's very well respected. The elders come and actually want to hear his prophecies. Another thing that's different about him, that's a large thing that's different about him. And also another thing that's different is who he's talking to. Okay. He is speaking to the nobility, and they have specific problems because they've been exiled first. They have been exiled, and there are still Jews living in Jerusalem. At this point, we call them Jews. They're Judeans. They're Jews living in Jerusalem. And those Jews who are living in Jerusalem have a working temple, and they have a king. And yet these people are exiled and possibly never going home. So what does that mean for their belief, for their connection to God? What does that mean for them? Okay. I want to remind you, because we take it so much as and I'll get to your question, Danny, in a second. We take it so much as a given that Judaism includes a diaspora community, okay? Because that's how we've all grown up. That's the way it's been for thousands of years. However, up to this point, Judaism has not included a diaspora community. The Israelites who are exiled by Assyria are gone. Now, they're not completely gone, by the way. A lot of them did escape to the south, and they did escape to Judea. And there are some that they're keeping their names, etc. But essentially, from the point of view of those Jews in Judea, those Israelites are gone. We don't know where they are. We don't have a connection with them. They become, over the generations, kind of this mythological people that we have no way of reaching. And now this group of Judeans find themselves in that situation. Now the Jews the Israelites who went to Assyria, they're gone. There's no connection with them anymore, at least not in the common culture and thought. There's no one knows, they're gone. They were lost, right? And what does that mean for these Jews who are exiled to Babylonia? Again, while there is a functioning Judean kingdom, it's not a situation where everyone's been exiled. Only these guys have been exiled, right? Now, Danny is pointing out in his question that if we look at the numbers, it looks like it's only about 5,000 Judeans who are exiled. The question is, as Moshe says, like that could have been 5,000 is a lot for this period of time. So that could have been pretty much the people of Jerusalem plus some Judeans in the outlying areas. Now, again, we know that there were Judeans who stuck around, right? We know that, again, because of the census, we have this kind of being copied into Ezra and the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. that seems to reflect people living in the countryside. That there are people who are living in the countryside, and that is kind of what you would expect. You would not expect these generally these empires. Their main thing is to get rid of the city. The main thing is to get rid of the people in power, right? And anyone with control. And you also want to punish, right? They're also punishing people by exiling them and taking captives, etc. However, to do some kind of huge production to make sure not a single Jew has remained in the Judean countryside is less what we would expect, and less what would make sense for them to do. And so that is, in fact, there are clearly people who have managed to stay in the countryside, right? Now, also, it's very possible that in general, when empires conquered, there was a lot of times there was kind of a salted earth approach, and what that meant was you may not have been exiled, but you would leave, right? In other words, they may not have exiled you physically, but your whole countryside was destroyed. You would have to find a different place to go. That's also a possibility, that you would simply have to migrate somewhere else, especially when your center was gone. Okay. I'll remind you that the destruction of Jerusalem, it brings me to another one of my favorite topics. So I'll try not to get too far off, but the destruction of Jerusalem was just as important to later Judeans as the destruction of the temple. In other words, the fact that Jerusalem was in ruins meant a tremendous amount to Jews, and we see that from Nehemiah, who makes it his goal to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, not the temple, because the temple is functioning, the city of Jerusalem. And he essentially puts his own life on the line when he asks the Persian king to allow him to do that, because numerous Persian kings have already said, no way are you rebuilding the city. Right. So it's not just the destruction of the temple, which is a central part of the exile. It's the destruction of Jerusalem itself. There is no more capital fortified city to be an anchor for the Judeans and the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And that makes a big difference in terms of where they are. But before that, again, they're the exiles that Yechezkel is speaking to. Now, those exiles don't know what this means for them. And I'll let me bring a verse that kind of shows what I mean and what I'm thinking of when I talk about this. Skip this. You see, I have a bunch of them open here. This one. Yes, here we are. Here we have one of the prophecies to Ezekiel, to Yechezkel. Ben Adam, achecha anshe geulatecha, v'chol beit Yisrael kulo, asher amru lahem yoshvei Yerushalayim, rachaku me'al Adonai, lano hi nitna ha'aretz l'marasha. So, human being, Ben Adam. This is the standard. This is usually the way that God calls Yechezkel. He always calls him son of man, which means person, right? I think mortal is actually a pretty good translation. Human, your brethren, the people who are your kinsfolk, the people who you would need to redeem if redemption was an issue, and the whole house of Israel, that those who dwell in Jerusalem said to them, they have distanced themselves from God. It's been given to us. The land has been given to us as an inheritance. Okay. What's going on? The people in Jerusalem are saying, hey, this is what happens to sinners, buddy. You guys have been exiled and we get your stuff. You're the bad guys. We're the good guys. You've been rejected. We continue as the people of God in the land of God, right? Now, this actually makes a lot of sense, right? Makes a lot of sense just from a historical perspective. This is what happens. You get exiled, you're out. This people who one assumes the people who are in are the people who are worthy, right? That's kind of what happened with the Assyrian exile. I don't think it's quite the same, because I don't think that the Judeans were saying, oh, well, they do, because if you read the books, the biblical books, they're saying, hey, those guys were sinners, they had it coming, and then they were exiled because they were sinners all the time, right? And we sinned less. right? We didn't sin the same way. We didn't worship idols. We just worshiped outside of the temple. So they got exiled, right? And now they're gone, right? Now afterwards, there's this yearning to bring them back, right? This yearning that we are not whole without these people who have been exiled, right? But the initial interpretation of them being exiled, if you're a God believer, right, is that God wanted this, right? Now, so it's very important for these new exiles to hear that that is not the case. This is not true. You are God's chosen, right? Now, that comes along with saying, and they're going to get exiled too. They're going to lose the land. They're no better than you, right? They're no better than you. They don't get the land. They're sinners, and the temple is going to be destroyed. Okay. But a big part of Yechezkel's prophet, or some of the most crucial parts of his prophecy, have to do with giving these exiles hope and an understanding of how things work, right? So not just hope, but also an understanding of, hey, yeah, you're going to be living in Babylonia for a while. The temple is going to be destroyed, and then everyone's getting exiled. And that doesn't mean that God's not with you, and that doesn't mean that God won't return you. He will, right? We're going to look when we come to it, the prophecy of the dry bones. Of course, all you have to do is read that prophecy to get the very strong current of, on the one hand, of the loss of hope of the exiles, and the other hand, Yechezkel's role in terms of giving them hope, right? Now, there's a lot more that Yechezkel does, and a lot more of a reason to learn the book, because that's not it, right? Yechezkel is unique in the way he addresses theological quandaries and essentially creates a whole new way of looking at sin and punishment. And so what do I mean? So what we have classically, okay, let's kind of dive in very, very quickly into a classic parallel between Yechezkel and Yirmiyahu, Ezekiel and Jeremiah, right? So let's see, I believe it's this, yes. Okay. So Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, back in Jerusalem, says that he's promising that, and I'm just going to read the English here, just as I was watchful over them to uproot and to pull down, to overthrow and to destroy and to bring disaster, so I will be watchful over them to build and to plant, declares God. Okay, God is promising, yes, you're going through destruction, but I promise that just as I destroyed, I will rebuild you. Okay. In those days, in other words, in this messianic age, when I rebuild you, I'm calling it messianic. There's no Messiah really involved, right? In this case, but in this age when God rebuilds, right? In those days, they shall no longer say parents have eaten sour grapes and children's teeth are blunted, but everyone, but everyone shall die for their own sins. Whosoever eats sour grapes, their teeth shall be blunted. So just a second, what does this mean? In this time period, Judeans have a saying, and they say, parents have eaten sour grapes, have eaten unripe grapes, and their children's teeth are blunted as a result. In other words, we, the children, are suffering for our parents' sins. And Yirmiyahu here is saying, in this future, when God rebuilds, no longer will you be able to say this, but everyone shall die for their own sins. Whosoever eats sour grapes, their teeth shall be blunted. What is implied here is, yes, you are being punished for previous generations, but once God rebuilds, that will no longer be so. Okay, that is the line that what seems to be being said here by Yirmiyahu. Yechezkel quotes the same thing and says something different. Okay, slightly different or very different, depending on how you look at it. The word of God came to me. Said, why are you saying this allegory, whatever you want to say, Admat Yisrael, on the land of Israel? In other words, this is what you were saying when you were in Israel, right? When you were in the land of Israel, you were saying this. Avot yochlu boser b'shnei abanim tikena. parents eat sour grapes and their children's teeth are blunted. In other words, again, we are suffering from the sins of our forefathers. This is something that you would say when you were in the land of Israel. That makes sense because we heard Yirmiyahu saying it to the people who are there. So this is something that you were saying in Judea. It's like Judean phrase. Okay. Chai ani Ne'um Adonai Elohim im yeh lechem od mashol hamashal hazeh b'Yisrael. And so God says, no way, you can no longer say this in Israel. Hen kol nefashot li hena kinefesh ha'avu kinefesh ha'ben li hena hanefesh ha'chotet hi tamut. All the souls, all the lives are mine. The father's life, the son's life, they're all mine. And I am telling you, the sinning person, the sinning life shall die. Okay, and then he has a whole explanation about how it works, how someone who's righteous and hasn't done anything wrong, they won't be punished. If they have a child who is horrible, they will be punished. If that person has another child who's righteous, he will not be punished. So he goes into generations, right, where only that generation will be punished. Now, more than that, let me see if I can find it. Yes. Yes. So just a second. So we see that the same phrase is being quoted by both. This is a phrase that everyone is saying. This is a Judean phrase, right? We are being punished for our forefathers' sins. And Yirmiyahu says, in the future, this will not be true. And Yechezkel says, this isn't true now. This is not true. You are not punished for your forefathers' sins. It doesn't work that way. You are punished for your own sins, period. Okay. Now, so this idea of individual responsibility, which Yechezkel pushes, is also very clear, and he says it as a universal. He gives an example to say specifically, and this is also unique for a prophet of Israel, to say this is true for everyone, even non-Israelites, right? He wants to say, he does a specific example to say this is not just Jews, right? This is everyone. What do I mean when I say he's talking about no collective punishment? He's against intergenerational punishment. And he also says there's no such thing as collective punishment. In other words, if Sodom is destroyed, if Sodom is destroyed, the righteous will go free. The righteous will be saved, right? But righteous men will not save Sodom, right? Righteous men will not save Sodom. Sodom will be destroyed and the righteous men will go free, okay? So here he gives an example. Ben Adam, I'm reading now from Ezekiel, Yechezkel Yudalet, Ezekiel 14, verse 13, Pasuk Gimel. Ben Adam, Eretz ki techtali lim'ol ma'al, v'natiti yadi aleha v'shavarti lamate lachem, v'shlachti bara'ah v'chrati v'mena adam uvehema. Right? Let's say there's a land, the whole land, they sin against me. And the punishment is a famine. So I sent a famine. And humans and animals are dying from this famine. And these three people are inside it. Who? Noach, Danel, and I'm specifically reading the Ketiv here, not the Kri. Okay, Danel, V'Iyov, Hema b'tzidkatam yinatzu nafsham ne'um Hashem Elokim. And he says, and there are these three righteous people. Who are the righteous people? The righteous people are famous non-Jewish righteous people. Noah, right? Noah. Danel, we now know. We didn't, if you see here, it's written Danel and it's read Daniel because it was fixed in the reading saying, well, we don't know who Danel is. They must have meant Daniel. In fact, Danel was a famously just judge that we know about now from Ugaritic literature, right? So in other words, in the ancient Near East, there was this mythic, just, wise person named Danel. So he's kind of, everyone knows about him. So it's Noah, Danel, and Eo, Job, right? Three non-Jewish righteous people. They will save themselves. They will not save the land. Only they will be standing in the apocalypse because only they were righteous. There is no such thing as collective merit or collective punishment. This is something that becomes very central. It's why, you could say why Yechezkel, why Ezekiel. We're going to talk about that more later when we get to it. But I think that a big part of it is that for the first time you have a prophet speaking to an exiled community. So the first time you have, in general, when prophets are talking within a land, okay, and let's say there's sinners and they're righteous, and there's a punishment that's coming, everyone's going to suffer. There's no such thing as getting out with, unharmed when there's a war that's coming to your city, right? A war is coming to your city. Everyone's getting hit. You were righteous. Well, I mean, it was nice that you were righteous, but your city's getting hit. There's no such thing as getting out without anything. If you're lucky, you'll be what they call a remnant, right? But that's more luck than it is merit. And there's an acknowledgement of that by the prophets, right? So Amos says, what do you want the day of the Lord for, Yom Hashem? Because it's a day of darkness and not light. You think you're going to get off scot-free? You are not, right? Yeshayahu, Isaiah talks about the remnant all the time, and he doesn't talk about it as if, if you're righteous, you're going to survive. No. There are going to be people who survive, but that doesn't mean, the fact that you're righteous doesn't give you a get out of jail free card, because it never does. People know in a land where everyone's living together that a famine hits everyone, a war hits everyone in some way. Everyone is hit, right? Once you have an exiled community, that community that's very connected to the land. In other words, it's an exiled community that's constantly getting news from Jerusalem. And you see that in the book of Ezekiel as well. They're constantly getting news back and forth from Jerusalem, and they're very connected to that community. And yet they know that what happens to them and what happens to that community is different. There is something that can happen to that community that won't affect them, and there's something that can happen to them that won't affect that community. And what it causes, it allows a different type of thinking in terms of individual responsibility. In other words, I can actually do something and only I get punished, no one else. And I can do something and be so good that they're punished and I'm not, right? And that becomes a very basic, something that everyone assumes. Again, this becomes kind of a basic idea of sin and punishment, where in other biblical books, if we think about next week's parsha, we're going to be reading about Sodom, about Sodom, and that dialogue that Avraham has, or this week's parsha, I should say, that Avraham has with God, and saying, won't these people, won't 10 people save the city? Because the idea is, collective punishment exists. In other words, the city's going to go down, but it's not right. It's not really fair for righteous people to die with the city. So the solution that Avram has is save the city. Save the city so that righteous people don't go down with the city. Because if the city is destroyed, the righteous people are going down. Now, my professor of mine, Mark Smith, he said, I was once talking to him about it, and he said, well, I always thought that the answer was that God says, God doesn't save the city, but he still extracts the righteous people, because God is God, and God can do that. God can get the righteous people out. Whereas a human being will just be like, oh, well, everyone's gone. But the fact is that there's an idea throughout the biblical books that collective punishment exists. It's just not, it's not really fair. It's not really right. Collective things happen to everyone together because everyone lives collectively. Once you have a group that is not a collective with this other group, they start saying, oh, wait a second, we're going on a different path. And that's the reality now. And Yechezkel is speaking to that worldview. And that becomes a basic part of Judaism. So it's, you could say, now my approach, if you say, what's your theological? My theological approach is, well, this was meant to, like, worldviews change, and they are meant to change, right? The things that were an answer previously, things like, oh, well, that person's suffering even though they're righteous because their father sinned, and that was a theological answer. That is now a theological problem for both Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel. It's a problem that needs to be solved. It needs to be answered. It's not an answer anymore. So anyway, we're going to see that in Yechezkel as well. And another thing I wanted to mention in terms of Yechezkel is that there is also an interesting of the prophetic books. Yechezkel is the only one, I believe, that Chazal, that the Talmudic rabbis, you could say, have a problem with the book being in the canon. Now, they don't have a realistic problem. In other words, they don't actually take him out, but they say, gee, he was almost out if it hadn't been saved. Why? Well, the classic thing, they have their two. Let's take a quick look at the sources. I'm going to pause actually for questions because I've been talking for a while. Any questions? Any comments? By the way, in our next classes, it's going to be much slower. We're going to come back to all these things. I'm just doing an introduction to kind of jump on a lot of the themes, right? We're going to take everything much more, kind of slowly and methodically in our next classes, but I wanted to kind of introduce you to some of the themes that we're going to be looking at and why Yechezkel is such a fascinating book and actually a person. I didn't even talk yet about the symbolic act, right? He has the most concrete, some of the most concrete prophecies and concrete symbolic acts of any other prophet. Concrete symbolic acts that are also kind of wild, and we're going to discuss that as well. And I think that, again, when we're talking about the concrete nature of things, it's because people are doubting, and they need to believe, and they need to actually in a way it concretizes what's going to happen, and also concretizes what the meaning of it is. There's a lot of his vision has a very concrete theological meaning in terms of the divine presence leaving the temple before it's destroyed, right? And for people to buy into that, it needs to be a very concrete description, or I don't know if it needs to be, but it is a very concrete description of what's going on.
Miriam?
Yes.
So I have a question.
Okay.
Okay. The concept, the idea of later generations being punished for the sins of earlier generations. So when that's presented in the Torah and Sefer Shemot, in the Shlosh Esrei Midot,
yeah.
So my understanding of that was always that since it's presented in the context of a litany of God's attributes of mercy, yes, it's understood that way, and it to mean that if God were to give immediate retribution, we wouldn't be able to take it. We'd just be destroyed. And therefore, God's mercy is that he gives us a payment plan.
100%. Yes, that is the context there. In that passage, what's the whole point? The whole point is Moshe says to God, he's like, you have to lead us. And God's like, you guys keep sinning, I'm going to destroy all of you, right? And then in the attributes of mercy, the idea that God stretches the punishment out over generations means that a generation isn't wiped out, despite the fact that people keep sinning. Absolutely, that is absolutely true. And in the context, it's absolutely an answer. And I think
wait, but I'm presenting it as a question, though. I'm asking, like, so for Yirmiyahu and for Yechezkel, yes, how did they relate to that idea?
Because at this point, so this is the story. When you're talking earlier, there's this idea that sin is a burden or a mark that cannot just disappear. When you sin, you do actual damage. Because you do actual damage, there's got to be a punishment. There's got to be retribution in order to clean up the sin, right? You're doing something almost physical when you sin, and therefore there must be retribution, and that retribution must be real. Okay. Now, once we get and you see the way Yechezkel talks about sin, it's much more the way we think about sin. You're sinning against God, and God can forgive it. God can forgive it. He can just forgive it, right? Just get rid of it. Just don't. Now, I'm not saying that Yechezkel isn't necessarily the first, because Micah, right? Micah talks about it, like he says, just throw them in the sea, right? You just throw them in the sea, right? But the idea that you can just repent, because that's also something that we see for the first time in Yechezkel, where, and now it's a question, right? Because you have Yom Kippur, where there's this atonement and there's this cleansing of sin. But for the first time, this idea that you can just wipe out a sin. The Yechezkel is like, hey, you can repent, you can change your ways. And by the way, the sins that he gives examples of are specifically things that you can fix. Like, you stole money and you can return it. that sort of thing. I don't think that he would necessarily say this about a murder, for example, but he says, hey, excuse me, if you sinned and then you repent, you will live. And if you were good and then you sinned, you will die. Now, where's the cutoff point for Yechezkel? That he doesn't explain. Because, like, if you can always repent, then how come I die? How come this guy died before he could, like, right? That he doesn't address. But he's the first person who says, hey, you sinned, no problem. Do right, fix whatever you did, and it's forgiven. You live. Right now, that's a different way of looking at sin. And I think the way people look at sin once you get to Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel is different, right? It's no longer something that is almost physical, that simply must be fixed, as it were, through a punishment. And so stretching out that punishment is actually kind if it would wipe out someone, right? Instead, it's something that you can literally just make disappear. And then it's a whole different story. Yes, question. Any other questions? I love that type of question, by the way. Thank you, Moshe. So, and it's also something, because it's something I thought about a lot and talked about a lot. So,
Miriam?
yes.
Do you have any idea how many people lived in Judea before?
Not offhand. I'll try to look it up. I'll make a note to look it up. Because I don't. I know that there actually are estimates about how many people were living in Jerusalem. I just don't remember. I've seen an article where there is an estimate in terms of not just the people who were in Jerusalem, but the people who were kind of living on the hills around Jerusalem, particularly after the Assyrian exile. It really expanded, right? Because there were people who went south, and there were also people who wanted to live closer to a fortified city. So I have seen at least one article estimating. So I need to kind of look that up and get back to you on that.
But are there estimates for all of Judea?
That I don't know about. I don't think so, but I can take a look. The truth is, I'd be surprised if there weren't, because everyone likes estimating. Like, how accurate they are, I don't know, but like I guess they're probably are.
Miriam,
Yes.
why did the Talmud scholars have a problem with the book?
Okay, so let's jump into those, because we'll do that very quickly, because I know we only have 12 minutes left. So I actually wanted to show that to you guys. If we take a look here, let's go here. Okay, so there are 3 passages where it talks about this desire to that the book of Yechezkel is problematic. Okay. Now, by the way, there's a nice article by Tova Ganzel. It's in the Journal of Ancient Judaism 2020, where she kind of looks at where she kind of posits how these different traditions kind of developed, and it's available free online. So if any of you are interested, you should look that up. I'm not going to talk so much about the development, but let's take a look at this is in Masechet Shabbat. Shabbat 13b, Yud Gimel Amud Bet, and so this is actually in the context of talking about Hananiah ben Chizkiah ben Garon, actually. He is credited here with writing Megillat Tanit, and they said, and now they're saying, oh, and there's something else that's really good about him, right? What's this thing that's really good about him? He said, Baram Zachor Otoa Ish Latov v'Hananiah ben Chizkiah Shma. He said this guy is remembered for good. She'il Malehu Nignaz Sefer Yechezkel. If it weren't for him, the book of Ezekiel, of Yechezkel, would have been kind of archived. Shayud Varav Sotrim Divrei Torah, because what Yechezkel wrote contradicted the words of the Torah. He contradicts the words of the Torah in very specific things, in sacrifices in general, in the number of sacrifices, and things having to do with temple service, right? So that's where he contradicts the Torah. Me'asa, what did he do? Helulo 300 garvei shemen v'yeshav b'Eliyahu drashan. They brought up for him 300 jugs of oil, and he sat in the attic, and he interpreted everything in Yechezkel so it would work with the Torah. Okay, very nice. Now, on the one hand, this is a tradition that says it was problematic. On the other hand, it was a tradition that says it's a very important book that has to be studied. It should not have been archived. And so this is a way that rabbinically they're kind of expressing their kind of problems with it, the fact that they know it really contradicts the Torah. It's a problematic book. However, it's clearly an important book. It's clearly part of the biblical books, and it has to be part of them. Let's look at another similar example. This is in the context of this is the context of the difficulties of Yechezkel. We're looking at Masechet Menachot 45a Memhei Aleph. So here, if we look, and I'm going to go back a little bit so you can see. I believe this is the one that has, yes. So here it has all sorts of different contradictions. Some of them it has a solution, and some of them it simply says, Parshazo Eliyahu Atiladosha. This passage is going to be interpreted by Eliyahu. Like, we have no idea how this works. We tried, we don't know. We're leaving it for Eliyahu, the prophet Eliyahu. When he comes back in the Messianic age, he will interpret it. Now, once again, we see how important Yechezkel is. No one's important. At this point, there's no doubt the Yechezkel is part of the Bible. You can't take it out, right? So the idea is we can't solve this, but in the future there will be a solution. We're just going to have to assume that there will be. Now, again, some of the things they do solve, some of the contradictions they do solve, and then we finish with an almost exact parallel. Amar Rav Yehuda Marav Zachor Oto Ish Latov, that person is remembered for good. V'Chanina ben Chizkiah Shmo, right? Chanina, son of Chizkiah, is his name. She'ilmalei hu nignas Sefer Yechezkel, if it weren't for him, the book would have been archived. Shayu dvarav sotrim divrei Torah, right? It's the exact same thing that Yechezkel contradicted the Torah, and so what did they do? They brought up 300 jugs of oil, and he sat in the attic until he solved all the problems. The question is, well, then why aren't you quoting all his solutions to problems here? No, right? So that it seems to be so essentially that's one of the things that Tova Gadol says, is that this is a kind of a tradition that's kind of stitched together based on different things. But here, let's take a look at two different another reason why Yechezkel is problematic. And this is this is in the context of they're discussing Yechezkel and his vision of the Maaseh Merkava, the divine chariot, which is very, very specific, much more than Yeshayahu, than Isaiah. He goes into details. You can draw what he is describing. I think I have said before, and we'll talk about it again, like I knew my mother was in a wood carving class, and she was, and who else was in it but Yisrael Eldad, and he wanted to carve the Maaseh Merkava. He actually wanted to make a carving representing the chariot, the divine chariot. His wife convinced him that it was not a great idea, and he dropped it. But the fact is, even though there are things that we don't understand in the text, you do get the feeling that you should be able to picture this exactly the way Yechezkel is describing it. Again, that is different from the way Yeshayahu, from the way Isaiah describes it, which is much more in general terms. Or you should say the divine, revelation, as it were. Yeshayahu describes it in more general terms. Yechezkel describes it in very concrete terms. And so here there's a whole section where the Gemara, where the Talmud is explaining what different things mean in it, and then there's a question of, are you allowed to teach this at all? And it's interesting. They're saying that how can you teach about the chashmal? Today, chashmal means electricity, right? They took a word full of mystery, and that you're not allowed to know what it means, and now we just use it for electricity in modern Hebrew. But this is supposed to be very mysterious. What does this mean? Who knows? Are you even allowed to teach it, right? where is the phrase? I'm trying to find it now. Hold on. There is a, let me find it. Hold on. Here we are. So they bring the story of Hananiah and Chizkiah talking about how he solved the halachic, the legal issues in Yechezkel. And then they bring a story about, another story about them. That there was a child, Maseh b'tinok echad, shaya koreh bebeit rabo b'sefer Yechezkel, vaya mevin b'chashmal, v'yatsa esh mechashmal usrafato. There was a child, literally you would say baby, but no, it means a child. There was a child who was learning, who was reading by his teacher, he was reading the book and he understood what chashmal was. He understood what chashmal was. And so fire came out and burned him up. So we're going to archive the book of Yechezkel. Amar lehem Hananiah ben Chizkiah, so Hananiah ben Chizkiah, the son of Chizkiah, said, he said, if this kid was smart, is everyone that smart? In other words, we shouldn't archive it because this child was just unusual, that he actually understood it. Most children wouldn't, most people wouldn't, so we shouldn't archive it. It's an interesting argument, particularly since it's a child. Like I would think, well, if a child can understand it, maybe it's really much easier to understand than is safe, but that's not his argument. And the fact is you've got the same guy who is saving the book of Yechezkel, not because of halachic arguments, even though you have that passage above, but because of the problem with the mystical nature of Yechezkel, the concreteness of the mystical nature of Yechezkel, and that this is simply too godly to learn without burning up and dying, right? That is problematic. That is an issue. And I think that if we look at these rabbinic passages, we see that there are these two problematic areas of Yechezkel. Part of it is the end of the book where he's talking about the future temple or the temple what should be happening there, and what he says contradicts the Bible. And the other part is how he deals with these mystical areas where he's describing the divine in very concrete terms, and that is problematic. Now, at the same time that it is being described as problematic, the rabbis are spending a lot of time, first of all, talking about how you can reconcile what he says halachically, legally about with the rituals in the Beit HaMikdash and the temple, and also what he means when he's talking about these mystical, they're actually explaining the mystical, the divine chariot. They go into it, right? So at the same, even though this is problematic, there are problems here. It is nevertheless very important to learn and to know. And again, at this point, like I think at every point, Yechezkel was considered a tremendously important book. We see in the Second Temple also. There are copies of Qumran, there are copies of Masada. There are it was considered a very important book and an integral part of the Tanakh. So Susan says the fire consuming the child is reminiscent of Nadav Avihu. Yes, and it's also the idea that the chashmal itself contains a fire, right? That there is this kind of repeating idea that how dangerous it can be to know something too else, and also that people who are tremendously holy and linked into the divine have this kind of fiery control. So it's also connected to that.
Yes. Can you tell us next week what is quote unquote known or surmised or about the actual person Yechezkel? Like, did he? I mean, like, I don't know what's the scholar.
Well, we can talk like briefly about just what we see in the book. Like he was married, right? Mm-hmm. He was a Kohen, he was a priest who seems to have come from that, one assumes that he was familiar with the service. If he's one of the Jerusalem exiles who's kind of part of the nobility, and he's a Kohen, he's a priest, one assumes that he has some connection to the service, and he's seen it. Also, he when he does talk about law, he seems to be kind of pro Stokey. It's like that the line of Kohanim really comes from Tzedek. And then when he presents, and this is of course the end of the book, but he has a whole thing where essentially the Kohanim in his vision of the Beit HaMikdash, the regular Kohanim are essentially given Levite jobs, and the Kohanim who are descended of Tzadok get the real Kohen jobs. So he kind of downgrades everyone. It's actually interesting that Hananiah ben Chizkiah, the guy who kind of saves Yechezkel in the stories, is also connected to Beit Shammai, which is kind of interesting because Beit Shammai is like this kind of stricter thing, and he's saving Yechezkel, who's also kind of has this kind of strict kind of image. But he also, there are also places where he says things which are kind of problematic for another reason. So, for example, he says Kohanim can't eat nevela or trefa. They can't eat, animals that are just like lying dead, and they're like, but no one can. Why would he say that? Why would he say it as if only priests can, right? So there are all sorts of issues with Yechezkel. But in terms of his personal life, like, again, he has a wife. She dies in the book. And I'll say it again when we read about it, but like that, once you see that he's got a wife, you can understand how he could do the thing of lying for multiple days on his side. You're like, oh, he's had a wife. So otherwise, like,
but he's not someone who prophesied at all. In other words, when he's exiled, there's nothing that distinguishes him as a Kohen from other Kohanim that you would suspect that he would become.
Right. So that's what's interesting, is that he seems to be accepted by his community as a prophet. Like, he doesn't get the same kind of pushback that Yirmiyahu does. Of course, he also doesn't have to deal with a king, right? Yirmiyahu is prophesying that there's a king who can imprison him. Yechezkel is in an exilic community that they can't imprison anyone. No one can really punish him. But far from punishing him, they're all listening. They're not necessarily doing what he wants, but they are listening to him. They are going to him to hear what he has to say. They are visiting him in his home, right? Even though he's doing very crazy things. So he clearly has quite the reputation by the time they're exiled. That's what it seems like. It doesn't seem like, it could be that his reputation begins in Babylonia. It could be that they know him, because one assumes that the exilic community pretty much knew each other. Again, they were the nobility, or the people who were the cream of Jerusalem. Again, they were also craftsmen. It wasn't just like noblemen, but they presumably knew him. But perhaps when he started getting prophecy was when his reputation really grew. That's hard to know. You can't really know that. He does have this very interesting kind of relationship with prophecy. There's another thing where we'll go into like his beginning as a prophet, where he stays silent, and that very weird kind of relationship with prophecy and what it means to be a prophet. So we'll discuss that. But numerous prophets have interesting relationships with prophecy. So we'll discuss that when we get to it.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining me, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week.